Whenever a stable forms in wrestling, there can be a number of different reasons for it happening. Maybe it's to put a bunch of people together who have good chemistry, maybe it's to get more faces on the show, or maybe it's to give the leader some extra focus. Sometimes, though, the idea is to get an up-and-comer over to a higher level. But what are the best examples of breakout stars coming from famous factions? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Cody Rhodes and his time in the Legacy. Yes, the biggest star in all of wrestling today, Cody Rhodes has now ascended to the top of the mountain in a way few will ever be able to do. And that's something which didn't always seem like it was going to happen for him, particularly not during his mid-2010s run as Stardust. But prior to this, there were big hopes being placed in the American Nightmare's shoulders. After all, that's exactly why he was made a member of the Legacy in 2008. Who were the Legacy? Well, they were a stable made up of second and third generation wrestlers, with the most notable members being Randy Orton, Cody Rhodes, and Ted DiBiase Jr. Obviously then, the plan here was easy to see because with the Viper already being a star come 2008, it was hoped some of his magic would eventually rub off on the other two and lead to them rising higher as well. But while this would never happen for Ted, it would come to pass that Cody would turn into a huge star. He just had to take an unusual path toward getting there was all. Sure, there would be pushes made for the grandson of a plumber to do something of note after the stable came to an end in 2010, and this would even see him become Intercontinental Champion for a while under his pretty underrated dashing and undashing incarnations. But when it comes to him being the man he is today, well, that wouldn't happen until he left WWE behind in 2016, and from there went out on a vision quest to find himself. And after he had succeeded in building himself back up, when he returned to WWE again in 2022, he was more than ready to be the guy, with this being exactly what he became. That's right, as things stand today, you could argue that Cody Rhodes has become an even bigger star than his former mentor Randy Orton ever was. After all, Randy never held the WWE title for a year during such a huge hot streak for the company. But what Randy did do was become the breakout star of a stable of his own back during the early 2000s. Of course, he wasn't alone in this. No, it would be both him and Batista who made their presence felt in Evolution. That's right, let's go back to 2003 here, as that was when an all-new stable began making waves on the WWE roster, a stable which was pretty clearly inspired by the Four Horsemen of Jim Crockett Promotions. And that's not just because Ric Flair was one of its members. No, it's also because the other leader of the foursome, Triple H, very much had the idea of using this group to build up some young talents. Who would those young talents be? The other two members of Evolution, of course, Randy Orton and Dave Batista, with the idea working out because by the time all was said and done, each of these men would be multiple-time world champions and easy cases for the Hall of Fame. Sure, in Randy Orton's case, there would be some ups and downs over the years, ups and downs which were usually a result of issues behind the scenes, but none of that would stop him from winning the gold on 14 separate occasions, all while he was main eventing WrestleMania on 2 separate occasions. Even today, in fact, now a little older and a lot wiser, the Viper continues to be a prominent part of WWE television, with him only recently having main evented a PLE where he challenged John Cena for the world title. And when it comes to Batista, well, he would go on to have arguably even more success. Yes, after winning the World Heavyweight title at WrestleMania 21 and from there ascending to the level of being one of the faces of the SmackDown brand, Big Dave would have a hell of a singles run, a run which continued on all the way up until 2010. And the only reason it ended there was because this was the point that he chose to go conquer Hollywood. Would he be successful in his attempts to do that? Yes, he would. Hell, today he's one of the more bankable actors out there, with his resume including the likes of Dune, Blade Runner 2049, and Guardians of the Galaxy. Still though, even if he was a big star in Tinseltown come the late 2010s, Batista continued to return to WWE periodically. And whenever he did, he'd often find himself getting tied up with his old buddy Randy Orton once more, as they did in the lead up to and aftermath of WrestleMania 30. Yes, by this point, both were undisputed legends of the industry, with that being something which would have never happened had they not had the chance to break out of Evolution back during the 2000s. But Big Dave isn't the only Hollywood star who first broke out in the ring as part of a stable. No, the same thing could be said about our next subject, The Rock, and his time in the Nation of Domination. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's obvious that The Rock was always going to be a superstar, because in an industry built around charismatic people, he might just be the most charismatic of them all. Seriously, there's a solid argument to be made that he's the biggest star the wrestling industry has ever seen, and that to this day, he's one of the best promos going. But back in 1996, when he was first introduced to fans, this was not the case. No, at that point in time, he would be widely rejected by the audience on account of his pretty bland white meat babyface character. So what changed for Dwayne Johnson? Well, in the autumn of 1997, he turned heel and joined the Nation of Domination, a group which was then led by Farouk. And once he did this, something was immediately unlocked within him as the boring good guy antics of Rocky Maivia transformed into the cocky brilliance of The Rock almost overnight. Needless to say then, by the time 1998 rolled around, The Rock was getting hugely over with audiences, and this led to him booting Farouk from the Nation and taking up the leadership role himself. And once he did that, he would truly become the star everyone knew he would be. Hell, so big of a star would Dwayne become, by the time 1998 was over, he'd be WWF champion, and by the time 2000 came around, he'd be the face of the company. But that was only the beginning for the People's Champion as it turned out, because as the 2000s got into full swing, he'd move over to Hollywood, the place he'd eventually become the biggest box office draw in the entire industry with his roles in franchises such as The Fast and the Furious. And even then, he'd still find time to return to the business that first made him a star, because as it stands today, he's a member of the board of TKO, WWE's parent company. Would any of this have happened if he hadn't first been a member of the Nation of Domination? Maybe. But then maybe not, as it was the Nation which first gave us the great version of Dwayne Johnson, and had that not been unlocked when it was, maybe he never makes it as far as the new millennium before being cut from his contract. Really, you can thank the stable for a lot then, as were it not for it existing and including a young Rocky Maivia at one point, the landscape of not just wrestling, but also of Hollywood might look pretty different today. But not all breakout stars of stables have to conquer Hollywood in order to be a success. No, some can just become a big deal in the wrestling industry itself. And if you need a perfect example of this happening in recent years within the NOIE family to boot, then you need to look no further than our next subject, Jey Uso, and his time with the Bloodline. Yes, while Roman Reigns was undeniably the biggest star to come out of the Bloodline, he was already a big star before he ever formed that group. And while Jey Uso is no slouch in that area either, his big moments prior to 2020 had all been a part of a tag team with his twin brother Jimmy. As a single star, however, well, this was not something anyone thought was going to be in the cards for the San Francisco native. No, as far as most fans were concerned, he was destined to be a team player for the rest of his career. But then something interesting happened. During the early days of the Bloodline, Jey got into a singles feud with the Tribal Chief, and over the course of this feud started to get over on his own. That's right, for the first time there was an inkling that maybe he could go all the way with his solo presentation. That said, Jey wouldn't fully break out as a singles act for a few years yet, as it was in 2023, upon leaving the Bloodline behind, that he'd move over to Raw and there become something of a breakout fan favorite. How would this happen? Well, with his yeet catchphrase, he was able to get over with audiences to another level than he had done before. And that would all lead to him winning the Royal Rumble in January of 2025. Where would he go from there? All the way to the top of the mountain on the red brand, because as it stands today, following his dethroning of Gunther at WrestleMania 41, he's the World Heavyweight Champion. Really, in many ways, this is the biggest example of someone breaking out from the pack we've seen in WWE for decades, as while it was always clear people like The Rock or Dave Bautista could be big names on their own, the idea that Jey Uso could do such a thing was a shock to almost everyone. But shocking or not, it happened, and today, he's a true superstar of Raw, and likely will be for some time to come yet. But let's move away from the men for now and over to the women instead, as it's in that division we find someone else who's broken out of the pack in a big way during this modern era, someone who's become the biggest women's star in all of wrestling today. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Rhea Ripley. Yes, back in the late 2010s, Rhea was still a talent trying to find her feet. Sure, she'd have success in NXT, mostly by becoming that brand's women's champion at one point. That said, upon joining the main roster in 2021, there would be a somewhat ropey start for the Australian. Really, it wasn't until she joined the Judgment Day in 2022 that she finally began to feel like a big deal on Raw. And part of the reason for that was because this was the point she started to develop her mommy character, a character which would fully come to fruition when she won the heart of Dominic Mysterio later that year. That's right, by the point her and Dirty Dom were an on-screen item, Demi Bennett had ascended to a level that few ever do in wrestling, as she became a bona fide draw and someone who was even starting to gain some mainstream attention. Where has this seen her land today? Well, she's just as big of a star now as she was back in 2022, arguably even bigger in fact. Though in 2025, she's having to do this without the Judgment Day behind her. Yes, after being given the boot from this group in 2024 and turning babyface in the process, Rhea has gone on to even bigger and better things as a true singles act. Just look at her show-stealing performance at WrestleMania 41 alongside Bianca Belair and Io Sky. Really, it's hard to imagine a situation now where she wouldn't be in the main event mix in WWE, as she's pretty much solidified herself as a permanent top-of-the-card talent, someone who's right up there on the same level as names like Cody Rhodes, Roman Reigns, and CM Punk. Would this have happened for her if she'd never had that run in the Judgment Day? That's hard to say. Sure, she was always talented, but as her early run on Raw showed, she was floundering for a little while there. And had she not joined up with Edge and Damian Priest, she might never have been able to unlock that character she has today, the one which has turned her into a modern-day version of Chyna in many ways. But what about the woman who ultimately usurped her in the Judgment Day? The woman who has also become a huge breakout star for WWE in recent years? Well, that would be our next subject. Who are we talking about here? Why, Liv Morgan and her time spent in the Riot Squad. Who were the Riot Squad? Well, they were a trio of females made up of Liv, Ruby Riott, and Sarah Logan, each of whom wanted to try and make their stamp on the roster in a way they hadn't been able to do alone up until that point. Obviously, given the name of the group then, it was expected that Ruby Riott would be the breakout star by time all was said and done. No, she'd end up leaving the company in 2021, and as for the other member of the faction, Sarah Logan, well, she'd also be released from the company on 2 separate occasions. When it comes to Liv Morgan, however, ever since the Riot Squad parted ways in 2019, she's been on a rocket ship all the way to the top. Hell, it would be in 2022, just 3 years later, that she'd find herself winning that year's Women's Money in the Bank contract. And once she had this briefcase in her possession, she wouldn't waste it. No, later that evening, she'd cash it in on Ronda Rousey to become the new SmackDown Women's Champion. Yes, in winning a world title, Liv Morgan was able to do what neither Ruby Soho nor Sarah Logan have been able to achieve themselves to date. And that wouldn't even be the end of the Morristown Girls' success in WWE. No, after her run as champion was over, she'd start courting the attentions of Dominic Mysterio, something which eventually led to her stealing Dom away from Rhea Ripley. And following that, she and Ripley would have a lengthy feud which became the centerpiece of the Raw Women's division for the better part of a year, one which lasted all the way up until the Netflix debut on January 6, 2025. Really then, if we're talking about breakout stars of the Riot Squad, it's impossible not to think of Liv first at this point, as she so far exceeded what either of her former teammates have done. And with her still being 30 years old, she has plenty of years left ahead of her to achieve even more. But at the end of the day, she is only one woman. When it comes to our next entry though, they're a complete trio. Why is that? Well, when we're talking about the Shield, the reality is that the breakouts were all of them: Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and Jon Moxley. That's right, when the Shield made their debut back in 2012, we saw 3 relative rookies, all hungry to make a name for themselves. And while most hoped they would rise to the occasion, the level to which they'd make a name for themselves would surprise many fans. Yes, even to this day, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and Jon Moxley are all on top of their respective brands. And in Roman's case, after the Shield ended, he'd go on to become the top guy in WWE. Sure, he might have struggled with this spot for a while, but once he turned heel in 2020 and transformed into the Tribal Chief, he'd become to a generation of fans what John Cena was to the generation before. A man good enough to be world champion for a staggering 1,316 days. And when it comes to Seth Rollins, the man responsible for the trio splitting, well, while he'd never quite reach the same levels as Reigns, he has carved out a spot for himself as a top guy, often the top guy on Raw, and often the one who's acted as the workhorse for the entire company as a multi-time world champion. But when it comes to the third member of the Shield, the man who went by the name of Dean Ambrose, well, he's gone on a different path entirely. And that's because ever since the group split, he's won the WWE title himself, left the company, and gone on to become, at times, the ace of All Elite Wrestling. Yes, at this point, they've fully succeeded in their original intention to take over the world of wrestling. But what of a woman who'd had a similar goal over the years? Someone who conquered her home country of Japan, and then once that was over, took her skills over to America to lay waste to the women there too. Well, she'd be our next subject as it happens, the clear breakout star of Damage Control, Io Sky. Now, when Damage Control was first formed back in the summer of 2022, there were 3 ladies who were a part of it: Bayley, Io Sky, and Dakota Kai. And at that point, it was very clear for all to see that the role model was the leader of the trio. Regardless of this though, many fans felt that Io was the best in-ring talent out of the 3, something she's excelled at ever since her days back in Japan. And that was also true when she made the jump over to NXT in 2018 and there quickly won world titles galore. Still, there were concerns that there was going to be a ceiling on what she could achieve in the WWE main roster, and these concerns appeared to be merited for a year or two there, as while she certainly did find success, she was never exactly positioned on the level of a Rhea Ripley or a Bianca Belair. But then something would happen in early 2025. Io would start to connect with main roster audiences in a way she hadn't fully done before, and this saw her not just turn babyface, but also walk into WrestleMania 41 as the reigning and defending Women's World Heavyweight Champion. Sure, that evening she'd be facing both Rhea Ripley and Bianca Belair, so the assumption going in was that she would be the one eating the pin here. But to the surprise of most, Io would actually win the bout. And at that point, it felt like she was fully solidified as a top star in the division for the first time, with her reaching a whole new level of having broken out ever since that moment. Seriously, as it stands today, Io Sky is now on that top level of women in WWE, way more than Bayley, and more than even additional members of Damage Control like Asuka and Kairi Sane. And with it looking like the group has now quietly disbanded, there's no telling how much higher she'll go. Will she do what no other Japanese star has done in WWE history and become the ace of their division, the undisputed top draw? It's certainly a possibility. So by the time all is said and done, she might be the biggest breakout star of any of the people we've looked at today. Well, at least biggest in spirit. When it comes to the biggest physically, though, that honor has to go to our next subject, Scott Steiner, the breakout star of the NWO. Sure, Scott had been a successful wrestler pre-NWO, but this had all been part of a tag team alongside his brother Rick, a tag team which had seen them win gold on no less than 12 occasions. When it came to singles competition, though, the Michigan native was completely untested, so when he turned heel on his brother in 1998 and joined the New World Order, there were some concerns initially about what he was going to do. Luckily for him, however, he would do great, and part of the reason for this was because he would completely transform himself. That's right, gone was the varsity athlete of before, and in its place would be the big bad booty daddy, a walking mass of muscle in a skin suit who delivered promos like William Shakespeare if he were hammered on tequila. Understandably then, this was a character which quickly caught the attention of audiences and made Scott stand out amongst the roughly 300 members of the NWO by the time the late 90s came about. So much would he stand out, in fact, by 2000 the big man would be WCW champion. And when the company died not long after this, for reasons that weren't related to Steiner, he'd jump back over to WWE for a cup of coffee, and there enter the main event scene for a while against Triple H. That's right, once Big Papa Pump broke out from the pack in the NWO, he was a made man for life. And that would carry on into his post-WWE run as well, the run where he became a key member of the TNA roster for a while, and there gave us some all-time moments, such as his iconic Steiner Math promo. But for as great as that was, and for as fun as Scott Steiner has been to watch for years now, he's arguably not as big a star as our next entry. No, when we're talking about the breakup member of the Brood, we are talking about one of the top guys of the 2010s and beyond. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Edge? Yes, back during the late 90s, the Ontario native was very much a rookie looking to establish himself. And this is what led to him becoming a member of the Brood in 1998, a trio of wrestling vampires, which also included Copeland's real-life best friend Christian, and which was led by Gangrel. Sure, it might have been a humble beginning for someone who would go on to later rise so high, but Edge, as he was then known, took the opportunity for all it was worth, with him quickly proving to his bosses that, by the time all was said and done, he was going to be the one to watch out for. Yes, come the turn of the millennium, it was clear that Edge was going to be the breakout star of the Brood, so when he became one of the first to reach the mountaintop in 2005 by winning a world title, it wasn't a huge surprise. And when he then went on to main event WrestleMania against The Undertaker, all while becoming the ace of the SmackDown brand for a while, it was even less of a shocker. No, by then it was doubly clear that Edge had all the tools required to be a legend in the wrestling industry. The only thing which could stop him, in fact, would be an unfortunate injury, and sadly for him, that's exactly what would happen, as it would be in 2011 that Edge discovered he had a pretty serious case of spinal stenosis, bad enough that he'd be forced to retire with immediate effect and vacate the World Heavyweight title he was still then in possession of. But this wouldn't be the end of the story. No, as the years went on and medical technology improved, he would eventually get cleared to wrestle once more, first for WWE between 2020 and 2023, and then for AEW from 2023 up until the present day. Needless to say then, this latter-day run has only solidified what we already knew, that Adam Copeland is one of the best of his era, and even if Christian did have multiple world title runs of his own and is still competing to this day, Edge remains the biggest breakout star of the Brood. Come on now, we're talking about an 11-time world champion. The only question left is how much longer can the Canadian go, as he's currently 51 years old. But even if he does retire soon, Edge will live forever in the work he's left behind, with him being able to prove with this work that, just like everyone else we've looked at today, if you really are a special performer, then you'll be able to separate yourself from the pack and become a breakout star of any stable you find yourself part of.